All right. Welcome, everyone, to a Wednesday evening conversation. Today, we're very happy to have Professor Jay Garfield with us. Jay, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's really wonderful to be here with you.
Okay, well, I'm going to read a quick biography of Professor Garfield for anyone who doesn't yet know him. So, J.L. Garfield is Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at Smith College, visiting Professor of Buddhist Philosophy at Harvard Divinity School, Professor of Philosophy at Melbourne University, and Adjunct Professor of Philosophy at the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies. His work is focused on Buddhist philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of mind, ethics, and cross-cultural work, addressing topics in cognitive science, modern Indian philosophy, epistemology, and Indo-Tibetan Madhyamaka and Yogacara Buddhism in particular. He is the author or editor of over 30 books, including Losing Ourselves, Learning to Live Without a Self, Buddhist Ethics, A Philosophical Exploration, Engaging Buddhism, Why Does Buddhism Matter to Philosophy, and How to Lose Yourself, an ancient guide to letting go, in addition to nearly 200 articles, chapters, and reviews. He is also the professor of the Great Courses series on the meaning of life. So, Dr. Garfield, thanks for joining us. And something which I didn't mention in that biography was how you came to study Buddhism. You've got a really fun article called Practicing Without a License and Making Trouble Along the Way. Could you tell your story of coming to Buddhist philosophy?
Gosh, it can be a long story, so I'll try to make it as short and sweet as possible. But I pursued my PhD a long time ago now at the University of Pittsburgh, at a place that, like almost every philosophy department in the world, especially at that time, taught no non-Western philosophy. So I finished my doctorate not knowing that there was such a thing as philosophy outside of the Western tradition. And my very first teaching job coming out of this very straight, very conservative analytic philosophy department was at Hampshire College, sadly about to be no more. But then a kind of cutting edge college that was highly experimental and highly interdisciplinary and highly innovative, and called by most people in the mainstream a flake college or a hippie college. So for me, coming out of Pittsburgh to Hampshire, it was quite a change of culture and milieu. But on my very first day at work, unpacking my very first grown-up office and putting my books on my very first grown-up bookshelves, this guy strolled into my office, really tall guy with very long hair and a long beard, with bare feet, dashiki, beads, bangles, whole 9 yards. Said, hi, my name's David and stuff, and I'd like you to chair my senior thesis. We call it a Division 3 on connections between Indo-Tibetan Madhyamaka and the Western social contract tradition. And I just looked at him and I burst out laughing, figuring somebody was giving me a welcome to Hampshire joke and had paid him $5 as an actor to do this. And he was kind of appalled because he had this really interesting project looking at resonances between political philosophy and early modern European philosophy and the epistemology of the Titanic figure Tsongkhapa, 14th, 15th century Tibetan philosopher. And he'd been really working on his Tibetan to read Tsongkhapa, and he was pretty good. And he had worked on his French to read Rousseau. And he had this very cool idea, and this brand new assistant professor was laughing in his face. So we got past that moment. He said, well, like Bob Thurman down at Amherst College, because back then Bob was teaching at Amherst, he's going to do the Tibetan stuff with me. I just want you to keep me honest on Locke and Rousseau. You can read Locke and Rousseau, can't you? And I said, yeah, I could read Locke and Rousseau. And I figured it was a bad idea to start my academic career by saying no to my very first possible student. So I agreed to do it. And of course, that meant that I had to read what he was reading. And that meant I had to read a bunch of Tsongkhapa. So the very first philosophical texts that I read in Buddhism, before I read anything else, before I'd heard of the Four Noble Truths, was Thurman's the rough draft of Bob Thurman's translation of Tsongkhapa's Lekshe Nyingpo, The Essence of Hermeneutics. So it's this extremely technical, scholastic text on how a Madhyamika can read the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, a text I'd never heard of course. And this was really the first time anybody had made a serious attempt to translate this kind of technical scholastic Tibetan into English. And while Bob did a brilliant job, it wasn't actually comprehensible, especially in that rough draft, especially to somebody who knew nothing about Buddhism. And I was just quite often totally lost. But I worked on this for a year with this student, and he produced a pretty good thesis. And I learned a little bit about Buddhist philosophy, and I found it intriguing. But then I put it down because I had a career to get going in logic and philosophy of cognitive science, and I didn't need any distractions on my way to building that career. And so I forgot about all of that for about 7 years, except to tell this story at parties sometimes. And then 7 years later, there was a big battle at Hampshire, big faculty battle, student battle. And to my undying shame, I was on the losing side of this, and I was on the wrong side, and I'm really glad my side lost. But the battle was over a new curricular requirement, and it was a strong multicultural requirement that Hampshire called the third world expectation. But it wasn't about Joseph Tito and big power politics. It was about multiculturalism. And it was a requirement that no matter what subject a student was studying, whether it was chemistry, physics, art history, philosophy, they couldn't just study the way it was pursued in Western culture. They had to study the way it was pursued in some non-Western culture, which makes total sense. Now, I and a lot of my colleagues were worried that this was going to be a serious violation of academic freedom because it was going to require us either to be charlatans or to retrain in stuff that we didn't have any interest in or know anything about. But it passed, and the college turned to us all and said, excuse me, we can't require students to study something we don't teach. So each of you has an obligation to retrain in some non-Western area of your discipline or resign. And I wasn't about to resign, so I panicked and said, I've got to retrain. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? And then I remembered medieval Tibetan epistemology. That was pretty interesting. I could get a grant and hire Bob to teach me enough medieval Tibetan epistemology to do a week or two in my epistemology course, and then I will have paid my debt to the third world expectation. So I applied for a grant to basically pay Bob to tutor me in Tibetan epistemology for a summer. And I added this stuff to my course, and students really liked it. So then the next year I applied for a bigger grant to get Bob to teach me a little bit more, to create a comparative epistemology course with Buddhism and skepticism. And students liked that even more, and I was starting to get interested in it. And there was a National Endowment for Humanities Summer Institute coming up in Hawaii on Nagarjuna and Buddhist and Asian thought. And I thought, well, I'll never get into this, but wouldn't it be cool to spend 6 weeks in Hawaii studying Nagarjuna with a whole lot of really smart people who know about this stuff? And to my astonishment, I got in and I went there, and that was really cool. And I had a sabbatical coming up, and I was asking people at this point, so if you're really interested in getting serious about Tibetan philosophy, where do you go? And everybody said the same thing. You go to the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies in India. So I applied for a research grant to go to India. To my astonishment, we got it. I packed up the family. We went to India. I spent a year there and never looked back. And that's the short version of the story.
Right. And you were staying at Sarnath, is that correct?
Yes, in Sarnath, exactly. That's where the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies is.
Where the Buddha taught his first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana.
Exactly. So I was staying within 10-minute walk of the stupa marking the site of the Dhammacakkappavattana.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mentioned to Jay before we started recording, but I also came across Buddhism at Hampshire College. I was an undergraduate there, and while studying the Dharmapada and other religious texts with Alan Hodder, a friend recommended that I go to a Goenka retreat at Shelburne Falls in the Vipassana tradition. So, and that just totally altered the trajectory of my life. I really didn't know Buddhism at all much before then. So,
so we each had our lives changed and directed towards Buddhism at Hampshire College.
Very much so.
Which was kind of wonderful.
Yeah, and that ties into kind of how I'm hoping to guide the conversation this evening. You wrote another book, which I didn't even mention, which is called Trans Buddhism: Transmission,
Yeah.
Translation, and Transformation of Buddhism, which talks about this interplay over the centuries of East and West, and that's kind of what we're living. We're founding a Theravada monastery in Seattle and living a Buddhist life according to Theravada rules. Um, but also curious about Mahayana Buddhism, Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, and also just noting that I know very little. In the monasteries I've lived at, we have had Mahayana Buddhist book sections, but there's no real curricula. And although we're friends with and take Tenzin Chodron as a mentor, there's still so much we don't know. So I'd love to just, um, help for myself and for listeners who are both convert Buddhists or not even Buddhists, but people born in non-traditional Buddhist countries, and also who have this Theravada inclination or Theravada foundations, how we might learn about specifically Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. I'm learning that that's kind of how it's often framed in academic discourse. So, what is Indo-Tibetan Buddhism?
Yeah, now I should say that there's controversy about that. Some people say the phrase Indo-Tibetan Buddhism is a distortion. Some people think it's exactly the right thing to say. I do think it's the right thing to say because the Buddhism of Tibet is very much an Indian import and very much a self-conscious Indian import. But it's also not just what was imported from India. Like any vibrant intellectual and religious tradition, it's progressed on its own in ways that take it to places that India didn't go before Buddhism came to Tibet. So I think it's the right way to think about it. Go ahead.
Yeah. To what extent is it similar to the Theravada Pali that we're familiar with, that I'm familiar with, versus has it branched on from there?
Well, Buddhism, as you would know, and as your listeners will know, was always a missionary religion. And it started in India near the Tibetan border in Nepal and northern India. It moved south to Sri Lanka and then to Southeast Asia and to Indonesia. It moved north to China and then to Tibet, and then from China to Korea and Japan. It's moved into Siberia and into other parts of Russia, Kalmykia, Tuva, places like that. And now it's moved into the West so that we have me sitting here in Tasmania and you sitting in Washington State. So Buddhism has always moved. And as Buddhism has moved, it's always transformed the cultures into which it's moved. But it's also always adapted to those cultures and had characteristics that come from the places that it's moved into. That's no different from now, where you, for instance, are in a Theravada monastery talking to somebody in a Tibetan Mahayana monastery regularly when you talk to Thupten Chidrenla. And that's one of the things that's happened as Buddhism has moved west. It's become a little bit more ecumenical because so many versions of Buddhism moved west at the same time. So there's nothing new. There's nothing new about the movement of Buddhism. And as you would know, one of the very central teachings of Buddhism, some people would say the central teaching of Buddhism, is anicca, impermanence. And what impermanence means is not just that things pass away, but that things that continue to exist are constantly changing, that things exist as continua of events and continua of processes, such that later points in those continua are very different sometimes from the earlier points. And that's true of Buddhism as well. It would be very odd to say everything is impermanent, except, for instance, Buddhist institutions. They change and evolve as well. And so I think when we look at the relationship between, say, Theravada Buddhism as practiced in the Thai forest tradition represented in Washington State and the Tibetan Buddhist tradition as practiced in, say, India or Nepal or in the United States or any place else, but right now, sadly, not very much in Tibet, because Tibet is occupied by China and Buddhism is very much repressed in Tibet itself. But if we look at the relationships between those, we're going to see an enormous amount that's the same. and then a few things that are a little bit different. And those differences don't reflect, I think, core ideas. Those differences reflect matters of ritual, matters of social organization, matters of monastic practice. And then the biggest one, of course, is that the Buddhism that moved into Tibet is Mahayana Buddhism and Tantrayana Buddhism. So the Buddhism that moved into Tibet is a version of Buddhism that was active in India in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries when this transmission was happening. Whereas the Theravada tradition, was a much earlier tradition, much earlier transmission. And so you've got evolutions in Buddhism in India that happened later. And we know that in India, there are many Buddhist schools active. Theravada was only one of the non-Mahayana schools. It's just the only one that is still extant. But then there are also many Mahayana schools. And so what we're looking at are different evolutions of the Buddhism that came out of the Buddha's awakening at Bodh Gaya all of those years ago. The Theravada tradition is one evolution, and it, of course, has evolved. And the Tibetan tradition is another evolution. But the similarities outweigh the differences. There was a wonderful gathering about maybe 8 or 10 years ago at Sarnath of monastic representatives from all of the Buddhist traditions in the world. And it was the first gathering like that since the last great Buddhist council. So a 2,000-year hiatus. And people kind of expected there was going to be a lot of debate and fights and, people with very different ideas. And what people discovered was that the differences were tiny and the similarities were enormous. And that people in the Mahayana tradition who thought, oh, well, nobody thinks about this in the Theravada tradition, were surprised to see those ideas there, and vice versa.
Yeah. So as you're describing this, you're using this hand gesture as the evolution of things. And
Yeah,
often heard this phrase, the 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma.
that's
And
right.
of course, in Theravada, we've just got one turning of the wheel of Dharma.
Yes, that's
Dharma
right.
at Sarnath, that's near where you lived. But as I read about, so I'd love for you to describe what these 3 turnings
Other
of the
two
wheel
are.
of Dharma are.
Sure.
And when I read about the second and third, I'm kind of underwhelmed. As you're saying, it doesn't seem that much different from what is being talked about in various sutras of the Pali Canon.
Exactly. And I think that's really important to remember. Now, there are extremely polemical and sectarian retellings of the 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma. And I really don't have much time for that, where you get the idea that, one is Buddhism for dummies and one is Buddhism for smart people and the other one's Buddhism for people who are okay but not really smart, right? I think that's bullshit. And that is sectarian stuff that we can set aside. But the first turning, of course, is the one that all of the schools have in common. And that is the teaching of the Dhammacakkappavattana. It means the turning of the wheel of Dharma at Sarnath. And I'm going to adopt His Holiness the Dalai Lama's description of the 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma, because I think it's really useful. And it actually is not original with him, but it comes from a great Tibetan scholar, Rendawa of the 13th century, who said the first turning of the wheel of Dharma teaches the general nature of samsara and nirvana, and teaches the path from samsara to nirvana, and establishes the fundamental principles of Buddhism. The second turning of the wheel of Dharma focuses on the notion of emptiness, and it focuses on emptiness from the standpoint of the object of knowledge. In Tibetan, we'd say shecha, something that's known. So when we look at those teachings, and those teachings are grounded in a set of sutras that are Sanskrit sutras, right? So they're not texts that were literally present from the time of the Buddha, though they present themselves that way. We could have a digression on that and questions about authenticity later. But those sutras are called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And the earliest of those, the most fundamental one that's called the Mother Sutra, is the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 shlokas. The Ashtahasrika Prajnaparamita Sutra. And then there are sets of increasingly long Prajnaparamita Sutras up to the 100,000 stanza sutra that are effectively elaborations of the 8,000. And then there are successive sutras that are condensations. The most famous of those is the Heart of Wisdom Sutra, which is very popular throughout Central and East Asia. But the smallest one is the Perfection of Wisdom in one syllable. And that is the sutra, which is very easy to memorize. It goes, ah. And if you're really smart, you can reconstruct all of Buddhism from that syllable, but I've never figured out quite how to do it. But the point about the second turning is that the focus is on understanding the idea of emptiness of intrinsic identity. Now, a lot of Mahayana practitioners are under the illusion that emptiness was not a teaching that's present in the Theravada Sutras. And of course, that's false. Emptiness is taught in the Theravada Sutras. But the emphasis on emptiness and its universality and its centrality, and the kind of reworking of the doctrine of the two truths that we see in the second turning, give the Mahayana in the Madhyamaka tradition, which is that tradition, a slightly different flavor. And we can see that in two respects. One, that in most Theravada presentations of emptiness, at least the ones that I'm aware of, and I'm not a Theravada scholar, so that's a big warning there. We're talking about emptiness of self, and we're talking about the emptiness of self in the skandhas. In the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the emptiness we're talking about is emptiness of intrinsic identity. And it's that emptiness of intrinsic identity in all phenomena. And the emptiness of self in the skandhas is but one instance of this larger phenomenon of thoroughgoing emptiness of intrinsic identity. That's one thing. The second thing that gives you a slightly different flavor is that the doctrine of two truths, which again is present in Theravada teachings, but in the Theravada is usually presented as the difference between definitive suttas and provisional suttas, or definitive sutras, or literal sutras and metaphorical suttas. So it's thought of as a difference in rhetoric, but that gets transformed in the Mahayana into a difference between two levels of reality, conventional reality and ultimate reality. And so you get this distinction between the everyday, mundane, ordinary truth that we inhabit, the truth of samsara, and then a truth of nirvana, which is the emptiness of all phenomena. And then you also get a complicated dialectic about the simultaneous distinction between the two truths and the unity of the two truths. And so that becomes a preoccupation in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, and hence in the second turning. The third turning, which comes a couple of hundred years later, is represented by the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, Sutra Unraveling the Thought, the Lankavatara Sutra, the Descent into Lanka Sutra, and a few other related sutras. And that's the turning that gives rise to the Yogacara school, the Chittamatra school. And as Rendala and His Holiness the Dalai Lama put it, that is a turning that's teaching emptiness not from the side of the object of knowledge, but from the side of the subject. And so it's providing an account of what emptiness looks like to the mind and what conventional reality looks like to the mind, and how the mind itself is the basis of distinction between conventional and ultimate reality, between reality as it appears and reality as it is. So Yogacara focuses on the pervasiveness of illusion in our understanding of the world, the omnipresence of illusion, and tries to explain how, through the processes of the mind, illusion emerges to generate the illusory world, and how we can transcend that illusion through a transformation of the mind. Yogacara is sometimes read as a thoroughly idealistic doctrine. I mean, it's called sometimes Chittamatra, mind only. And there are idealist strains in that third turning set of teachings, but there's also a deeply phenomenological strain. And so I think the best way to read the phrase mind only is, as my colleague Dan Lusthouse has put it, that your mind is the only thing you need to worry about. Your mind is your only problem. And so Yogacara is really focusing on the same emptiness that Madhyamaka, or the second turning teachings, are focusing on, but focusing on it from the side of subjectivity. And so emptiness there looks not so much like emptiness of intrinsic identity, though it is, but it's thematized as emptiness of subject-object duality, emptiness of existence externally to consciousness. And so focusing on that phenomenological dimension. So those are the three turnings. And once you spell them out that way, you see that we don't have differences in doctrine here. We don't have differences in ideas about what liberation looks like and what samsara looks like. What we have are differences in emphasis and differences in where things are placed.
I very much appreciated. You've got a 12-part lecture series that you taught over Zoom with Sravasti Abbey 4 or 5 years ago. And in the very last lecture, that whole lecture series is about the difference between that second and third turning of the wheel between Madhyamaka and Yogacara. And in the last lecture, I think someone had just sent you a Pali Sutta, the one to Bahia, where the Buddha teaches Bahia, in the seen, let there be only the seen, in the heard, only the heard, in the cognized, only the cognized, in the sensed, only the sensed. And you said, oh, that was great. That's totally, in line with these second and third turning. And so I appreciated that, the consilience you pointed out between those. And something I'd like to go a bit more deeply into, which I only learned in reading part of your book on Buddhist ethics. You mentioned in that second turning of the wheel, there's the perfection of wisdom in 8,000 lines. And point out that there's a shift in what is considered Buddha Vachana, or word of the Buddha. So in Theravada or in Pali, basically most Theravadins think that the Pali canon is Buddha Vachana, word of the Buddha. And in the 8,000 lines of Prajnaparamita, you point out that it's said that also anything completely consistent with the Buddha's teachings and inspired them is also considered Buddha Vachana. And then your commentary continues. This new definition facilitates accepting these later scriptures as canonical sutras, and it is important to emphasize that these texts and others that followed them are taken by Mahayana practitioners to be Buddha Vachana. Could you talk about that, this issue of authenticity and how that's held by Mahayana practitioners?
So think about this historically for a minute. The second turning is happening historically as opposed to canonically about 500 years after the death of the Buddha, right around the turn of the millennium. Canonically, it's happening while the Buddha's alive and he's doing all of these transcendent teachings at the same time that he's doing Theravada teachings, but that's not historically accurate, and I don't want to pretend that it is. So what's going on? New schools of Buddhism are arising, and they need sutra foundations. And so people, very serious monks, are composing sutras about 500 years later, like the Prajnaparamita Sutras, and a little bit later, the Yogacara Sutras, like the Sandhinirmochana, and so forth. And of course, they've got a legitimation problem, because these aren't turning up in Pali, they're turning up in very beautiful Sanskrit, and they're turning up long after the Buddha's death. And so you need some strategy for legitimating them. Now, one strategy, which is very much around, is the strategy that says, look, the Buddha actually taught all of these in beautiful Sanskrit when he was alive, and worried that they were too difficult and advanced for anybody to understand then. He entrusted them to the safekeeping, as you would do yourself, of sea serpents, who kept them safe under the ocean and were told to hold them there until a monk from South India called Nagarjuna came to the seashore and asked them for them to be returned. And Nagarjuna did that, and all the Mahayana Sutras appeared, handed to him by Nagas, hence his name, Nagarjuna, right, the master of the Nagas. Now, that's one legitimation story, and you can believe it if you like, and there are people who do take it literally. I don't. I think it's highly metaphorical. The other legitimation strategy is the one that you mentioned, that's internal to the Ashtahasrika, which says, look, the definition of Buddha Vachana, the old definition is anything spoken by the Buddha or spoken in the presence of the Buddha and approved by the Buddha, because of course a lot of suttas are actually not spoken by the Buddha, but are spoken in his presence. And at the end he says, well said, right? That's exactly how it is. And so that becomes a sutta, even though it was spoken by somebody else. But they added the third clause, or inspired by the Buddha and completely consistent with what the Buddha taught. And this opens up an open canon, right? And so we talk about the Mahayana canon as being an open canon, because in the Mahayana, the Buddha is thought of as a kind of transcendent celestial being who emanated his body, his nirmanakaya, into the world in the form of Siddhartha Gautama Shakyamuni Buddha, but is capable, but has emanated countless Buddha bodies in countless different worlds in countless different times, but also is capable of directly inspiring people who study Buddhism. And so the Mahayana, in the Mahayana, practitioners think of these sutras as inspired by the Buddha, consistent with what he's saying, and so worthy of canonization. And of course, that's a difference between the Theravada tradition and the Mahayana traditions. So I remember once I was in an inter-Buddhist, I want to say interfaith, but that's the wrong way to put it, interdenominational Buddhist meeting. And there were Theravada monks and Mahayana monks, Theravada nuns, Mahayana nuns present, as well as Theravada and Mahayana lay practitioners. And somebody began quoting from the 8,000 line, and one Theravada monk there said, wait a minute, I thought this was a meeting about Buddhism. There was this kind of uncomfortable moment. But I think that it's really important to see that the Buddhist tent is a very large tent, and discussions of and conditions of canonicity may differ from place to place. But that important caveat, inspired by and completely consistent with the word of the Buddha, is meant to sort of be the brakes on anything goes. And in the Mahayana tradition, people think that these sutras were indeed inspired by the Buddha, sometimes, in a very direct sense through visions, sometimes through study, and completely consistent with what the Buddha said.
So we're going roughly historically through time, from the time of the Buddha, maybe 500 years before, 500 BC, and then Nagarjuna, the second turning in maybe 100 BC, and the third turning. And again, these are a whole series of writers writing for centuries, and then Yogacara maybe in 100 AD onward, roughly speaking.
Well, about 200 or 300,
300, okay. Well, I'd love to actually skip forward, many centuries, skipping third turning. And again, these are a whole series of writers writing for centuries, and then Yogacara maybe in 100 AD onward, roughly speaking.
Well, about 200 or 300,
300, okay. Well, I'd love to actually skip forward, many centuries, skipping Shantideva, who you wrote a whole book called How to Be Caring, which are translations and selections from his Bodhicharya Vatara, which is a fantastic, your translations are great, and it's a fantastic text for anybody to read of any school of Buddhism. But jumping forward to actually Tibetan side of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, and I'd love, in shifting to that area of study, could you tell, you actually had a meeting with the Dalai Lama in the early 90s, and you came away from that with a quote that said, when the Dalai Lama asks you to jump, you jump, and on the way up you ask how far. What was his jump that he asked you to do?
So I'd been in India for a year at that point, and my family and I were about to return to the United States, and I was conscious that I had received an enormous gift from the Tibetan community. I'd been studying with some of the greatest Tibetan scholars of the 20th century, and had also the opportunity to teach and to conduct seminars in Western and Buddhist philosophy at tremendous institutions. And in doing this, I'd incurred an enormous debt to the Tibetan community. So I was asking His Holiness what I should do when I got back to pay that debt back. And what he said was, I'd like you to establish an academic exchange program that would link your colleges in the West with Tibetan universities in India. I would like Western students to be able to come regularly to study at our institutions. And I would like Western teachers to be able to come to teach at our institutions. I would like our teachers to have the opportunity to teach in your institutions and our students to have an opportunity to study in your institutions. And I'd like to see joint research projects that brought together Western and Tibetan scholarship. And I thought, well, that's a big ask, especially since I was teaching at a small, impoverished college. And so this was a conversation in Dharamsala, and I went back down to Sarnath and talked to the director of the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies at the time, Samdang Rinpoche. And I said, look, the Dalai Lama, His Holiness has asked us to do this. And he just said, well, if His Holiness has asked us to do it, we do it. And I thought, well, that's easy for you to say. But what are we going to do? And she said, well, we'll do exactly what he said, but your first step is to go back and talk to the president of your institution. So I went back to Hampshire, and the president then was a guy named Greg Prince. And I was fully prepared that I would go back there and he'd say, this is crazy. We don't have any money for anything like this. How could we possibly do it? I outlined the plan, and he said, sounds good, let's do it. And I was kind of taken aback. And that year we began. And that program has now been going on for almost 40 years. And hundreds of students have gone through it from the West, dozens of students from Tibet. And there have been an enormous number of research projects that have come out, both in philosophy and cognitive science. And it's been the thing that's given me the greatest joy in life. It's been watching that program evolve. If you'd stayed at Hampshire long enough, you probably would have gone, and then you'd be wearing red robes instead of yellow.
That's hilarious. I was actually about to say the same first part of what you said. I probably would have gone to India and studied Tibetan Buddhism, gone on that exchange program. But it is interesting, our different paths and the different affinities that we have. And you've subsequently learned Tibetan, both classical Tibetan and how to speak Tibetan. And so I'm curious to shift, to what extent is Tibetan Buddhism a different jnana than Mahayana? So sometimes I've heard the tricycle, like the third cycle, the third wheel of the tricycle of Buddhism being Theravada or Hinayana, it's called Mahayana, and then Vajrayana. And I'm curious if you can say to what extent it's different, to what extent it's the same, and to what extent, once at Sravasti Abbey, I called whatever the Buddhism they practice there by the wrong thing. I think maybe I called it Tibetan and she wanted it to be Vajrayana, or maybe she wanted it to be Tantrayana. But what is the appropriate names for these, and what do each of these suggest?
So these aren't really the three turnings, but the three vehicles. So that's a slightly different trio. There's a lot of threes, right? Three jewels, three turnings, three. And so yes, when people talk about that from the Tibetan tradition, they'll talk about the Shravakayana vehicle, that is the disciples vehicle, which refers to all of the pre-Mahayana schools, including Theravada. The Mahayana, and that's a pejorative term, it means greater vehicle, greater than what, greater than that one. So let's, cards on the table, it's a sectarian term. And then the third, Vajrayana, the diamond or the Vajra vehicle, and that's the tantric vehicle. And by the time Buddhism moved into Tibet, Vajrayana was a very, very active, very dominant force in Indian Buddhism, as was Mahayana. And Shravakayana schools were there, but they were much smaller and were much, much more influential in places like Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. So the Mahayana and Vajrayana had kind of taken over. And the big difference is that when we think about the Mahayana vehicle, we're talking essentially about a scholarly and meditative practice form of Buddhism. And when we move to the Vajrayana, that form of meditation is turned into Tantra. So it's heavy on visualization and self-transformation meditations. And it's within the Mahayana, like the Theravada, there's this assumption that awakening is a project over many, many lifetimes. Vajrayana, we talk about the lightning vehicle, it means it's really fast. And it's meant to be able to facilitate awakening in this very life through tantric practices that involve tremendous technologies of self-transformation through visualization practices and sometimes through physical action practices. And the Buddhism of Tibet, academically, is very much a Mahayana tradition, but where Vajrayana is really valorized, and a lot of the most advanced practitioners are practicing tantric practices.
And yeah, that term Tantra, I think, is often misunderstood, certainly by me, and certainly in theravada circles. We have a very Victorian ethic sometimes, and we hear the word Tantra, and it's like, whoa, scandalous,
Yeah.
risky.
Well, there are some tantras that monks can't practice
Right. Okay.
because they would involve transgression of monastic vows. But lay tantric practitioners are a whole different kettle of fish. And so in Tibet, you'll see people in red robes who are monastics, but you'll also see people in white robes who are tantrikas and who are devoted to tantric practice, take tantric vows.
So this kind of bleeds into my next question, which is about the four schools of Buddhism and of Tibetan Buddhism, and yeah, what is their history? How different are they? Is there any kind of analogy with Theravada Buddhism that our people might be more familiar with? Like, is it somewhat equivalent to Burmese Buddhism, Thai Buddhism, Sri Lankan Buddhism, or to the Abhidhamma tradition versus the Sutta
Yeah.
tradition, forest monks versus study monks, or what's up with the four schools?
That's an okay rough analogy. And by rough analogy, I mean it points to the fact that there's not a lot of big doctrinal difference, but there are slight differences in culture and in practice. So of those four, and there are actually more than four. There are four big ones, and then there are small ones. But if we think about the four big ones, the Nyingma school, the Kagyu school, the Gelug school, and the Sakya school. The oldest of those is the Nyingma, which basically means the old tradition. And the Nyingma school is grounded much more in the teachings of Guru Padmasambhava, so it's a much more tantric school. And they emphasize Tantra more. They don't emphasize philosophical study as much as the others, though to say, I'm saying don't emphasize, but there's a lot of philosophical work in the Nyingma school. But the real valorization and the centerpieces of Nyingma are learning the tantric cycles and doing tantric practice. Kagyu, which is the oral lineage school, is a school that's grounded in the teachings of Naropa, Tilopa, Milarepa, and so forth. And that's a school that, again, has a philosophical component, but the philosophy there involves a real synthesis of Madhyamaka and Yogacara, and also involves a great deal of meditative practice as central to what they're on about. More meditative practice emphasized than philosophical practice. The Sakya and the Gelug schools are both highly academic philosophical schools. Again, though, they do engage in tantric practice, and they have tantric colleges, but their monastic colleges are degree-granting colleges that look a lot more like Western universities or like Nalanda University, right? They're universities that have a curriculum in Abhidharma, curriculum in Madhyamaka, curriculum in Yogacara, curriculum in Vinaya. So they're doing a lot of academic study, and only a very small number of their practitioners go on to study Tantra. And go on to the tantric colleges. And the differences between the Gelug and the Sakya tradition are pretty technical philosophical differences having to do with the relationship between the two truths, the nature of emptiness, questions about ineffability. But they're very technical philosophical differences, and the schools are often pretty closely aligned. So what we're looking at are schools with different kinds of cultures. A culture that's more tantric, a culture that is more involved in meditation and visualization meditation, and two that are much more involved in academic study.
Okay. And most of your teachers have been in the Gelug school, is that correct?
Yes, most of my teachers have been in the Gelug school. I've also received teachings from Nyingma, Kagyu, and Sakya scholars, though, and I've got close colleagues in both the Kagyu and the Sakya traditions.
And there's both monastics and lay people in all four traditions, or?
Yeah, Yeah, there'll be families, for instance, who say we send our kids to Sakya monasteries, so we engage when we use when we engage religiously, we engage the Sakya tradition, even if they're lay people, other people whose families are more associated with Gelug schools or with Nyingma schools.
Well, I'd love
But
to
it's the
now.
same Vinaya throughout. So in that sense, it's the same school, same monastic discipline. We're looking at differences in academic and practice culture.
Okay. And the Dalai Lama is Gelug as well.
Oh, Gelug, that's
Is
right.
yeah, Tupten children and all
They're
of
Gelugpa.
Gelugpa.
Yep,
Okay.
that's Gelugpa. Yep. But if you look at other very prominent lamas, like the Karmapa is from the Karmakagyu tradition.
Well, I'm curious actually to kind of go into some of the details as just I've seen them as being slightly visually different or certain words that I have come across in Tibetan circles. And I'd love to just kind of hear your more in-depth analysis of these words, concepts. And the first one is just around sila or ethics as it manifests in Tibetan Buddhism. You have a wonderful quote from your teacher, Yeshe Tabke.
Yeshe Tabke, yes.
Yeshe Tabke, that every syllable of Buddha Dhamma is about ethics.
Yeah.
I love that so much. And it really points to the primacy. He was Gelugpa as well? Is that?
He's a Gelug scholar, yes. He's my principal root teacher.
Well, I mean, knowing Thupten Chodron and just seeing the ethical foundation, really, there's super solid ethics there. Yeah, it just makes me feel very comfortable around them. And, certain other teachers, have come to the West, and there have been scandals around sila ethics. To some degree more than there have been there's also been scandals in Zen circles and not so much in Theravada, fortunately. But how do you understand that? How can that have occurred, these kind of lapses of sila when every syllable of the Buddha Dhamma is about ethics?
Because people are imperfect. Very often, I see this as a kind of danger of the teacher-student relationship. It's there in Western academia. You'll see teachers who fall into improper relationships with their students. And in monastic situations, especially teaching situations or meditative supervision situations, there's an enormous, a special kind of intimacy. That same intimacy there is in a teacher-student relationship. And that intimacy is different from sexual intimacy. It's different from, relationship intimacy, if you use relationship, meaning romantic relationship intimacy. But it's an intimacy that naturally grows in any kind of pedagogical relationship, whether you're supervising somebody as a meditator or as a PhD student or as a beginning undergraduate student. You expect that kind of rapport to be there. And notice that's in the Buddhist tradition as well. So when we look at what are the qualities of a teacher, one of the qualities of the teacher is the ability to inspire students, the ability to attract students. And that means the ability to build a relationship, to build a rapport. Because if you can't do that, you can't teach. Now, human beings, as I say, are fairly imperfect objects. And it's very easy, I think, and very tempting to slide from one kind of intimacy to another. And I don't think that's any different in monastic teaching situations from lay teaching situations. It's just that it feels much more egregious in monastic situations because of vows and because of the special kind of trust that people have in monastics because they know they've taken vows. But again, I think that same trust should be there in lay institutions as well. If a student comes to me, she should know I'm not going to be, looking for romantic partners. I'm looking to teach, and we're going to work very closely together. I'm going to take her ideas very seriously, her welfare very seriously, but that's different from becoming a romantic partner. And I think that it's easy to slip. and it happens. And it happens also in the Theravada community.
It
Happens
does.
in any community, because any community has got imperfect individuals in it.
Yeah.
And the moment you get that kind of combination of hierarchy that makes somebody look up to somebody else, and somebody else maybe begin to think that there's something very special about them, and intimacy, then you have danger. And you've got to be constantly vigilant about that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And as you're speaking, I'm remembering another teaching I've heard of from the Tibetan is that in Tibetan Buddhism, there's not just three jewels, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, but also the fourth of the Guru Jim, the
That's right.
Guru. And, having read some Tibetan texts that talk about actually holding the Guru higher than the Buddha.
Yeah.
Could you speak about that? Is
Yeah.
that, yeah, please.
Yeah. So one of the first tantric initiations I ever attended was one conferred by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, and that was the Lama Chipa, which is Guru Puja, which is a ritual that many Tibetans engage in almost all the time, and it's one that's designed to increase your degree of devotion to your guru, to your teacher, with the view that it's only if you've got a total devotion that you can really put the effort into study and teaching and really listening that's necessary. Now, in the preamble to that, His Holiness always gives these great talks before any ritual, and he gave this great talk, and he said, there are people who talk about their devotion to the Buddha, or their devotion to the Sangha, or their devotion to the Dharma. He said, I can't take that seriously. I mean, he always has a sense of humor, too. He says, the Dharma, it's so complicated, nobody can understand it. If it was meant to be something you were devoted to, why didn't the Buddha make it simpler? He said, the Sangha, he said, you may not know many monks, but I've lived among them all my life. I know that most of them are not worthy of any reverence or devotion at all. For them, it's just a job. They're social parasites who have found a way to get by without working. And then he said, and the Buddha didn't even care enough about you to be born during your lifetime. Why be devoted to somebody like that? He said, but your guru. He cared enough to be devoted to be born during your lifetime. He cared enough to spend time teaching with you that he could be doing other things. And he's given you teachings that enable you to understand the Dharma and to develop some kind of respect for the Sangha. So whatever is good about Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, all of that is even better about your personal teacher. So spend time developing confidence in your teacher, and realize that your teacher is the emanation of the Buddha here and now. That what your teacher tells you is the emanation of the Dharma here and now. That your teacher is Sangha, the assembly of people to whom you want to belong. And if you approach your teacher that way, you're going to be able to learn from your teacher. And I thought that to be very useful.
That's beautiful, Jay. And I've got lots of mudita, or this sympathetic joy that you have the Dalai Lama as a personal teacher in many instances. And yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right that there can be monastics who are social parasites. And I personally feel really fortunate that in the tradition I ordained in, especially my main teacher, Lumpur Pasano, was just such, I mean, we don't have that guru Jim, but, when we ordain, the framing is such that I hold him as a father and he holds me as a son. And it felt like that. And he was definitely a very extremely worthy father figure in many ways. So I can see the idea, the kernel of the wisdom of that Guru Jim idea.
Yeah. One of the things that people sometimes forget about Buddhism and about Buddhist societies is the importance of lineage. So the robes you're wearing were given to you by somebody who was given those robes. The vows you've taken were given to you by somebody who's taken those vows. And that person received their robes and their vows from somebody who had received them. And that lineage goes right back to Sarnath and the ordination of the first monks in the Sangha by the Buddha. And that lineage is what makes those robes precious, not the quality of the cloth, not the particular color, not how cool they look. It has to do with that lineage. And the teachings that you're able to give are teachings you received from a teacher, who received them from a teacher, who received them from a teacher. And so it's not just ordination lineages, but teaching lineages. And the Guru Puja is about how important teaching lineages are, as well as ordination lineages.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I can really see it in you, like the transmission of facts, the transmission of knowledge, and you present Tibetan Buddhism, Buddhism in general. Basically, everything that I've heard you present, especially that Great Courses series. I listened to most of it on the meaning of life. Very systematic, and it's really a gift of teaching skill. And in other forms of Buddhism, not so much, certainly not explicitly in Theravada, but this idea of transmission. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about Dzogchen and the
Mm.
pointing out instruction. What is Dzogchen? What is pointing out? And what is transmitted beyond words there?
Mm. Okay, so the first thing I should say about that is that I'm not a Dzogchen practitioner or master. And a lot of Dzogchen is esoteric. That is, that you only know it if you're inside it, because it's not transmitted generally. So nothing I say is authoritative. Everything I say is completely general, and you shouldn't take any of it seriously. And so when I'm confessing the ignorance here, it's not some kind of false modesty. It's that we're talking about an esoteric tradition from the outside, and that's very dangerous. But what's transmitted in what pointing to the nature of mind is in Dzogchen is the idea of giving somebody a direct perceptual insight into the nature of their own mind and its relationship to reality. So one of the things we talked about earlier in our conversation was the kind of difference between second and third turning teachings. And a lot of what animates Dzogchen are third turning teachings. That is the analysis of the nature of mind and illusion that is articulated by Yogacara masters. So it's very important to see, and this is something, again, I think that people often miss when they think about Buddhism, is that when we look at the scope of illusion, the scope of and which of course is the root of suffering, it's not restricted. Illusion is all pervasive. So anybody who says, I might be mistaken about the external world, but when I look in at the nature of my own mind and what I'm thinking now, I can't be wrong about that. That's immediately present. That person's an idiot. Because the only way that we know our own mind is through our introspective faculty. And that's as subject to illusion as anything else. So any pointing out of the nature of one's own mind has to be kind of catching us in that, this is a Dzogchen view, right? That catching us in that moment where that nature of mind, that luminosity, is immediately present and not filtered through introspection. And the ability to see that and to capture that luminosity is what Dzogchen practitioners take themselves to be transmitting. And so that requires enormous insight by the teacher into the student, and the student's ability to hear exactly what the teacher is talking about and to see what's being pointed out. So, it would be like this. I could talk to you for a long time about how beautiful sunrises are in Tasmania. And believe me, I talked to a lot of people a long time about that. And what you would know at the end of that was that Jay can talk for a long time about sunrises and that they must be really cool. But if anybody asked you, do you really know what a sunrise in Tasmania is like? The answer is not till you come here and see one. And so again, from the Dzogchen point of view, we can talk a lot about the nature of mind and the primordial nature of consciousness. And what you have at the end of all of that talk and all of that scholastic literature and all of those discourses are a lot of words. And they tell you something, but they don't give you the thing to which they're pointing. But there could be a moment when you're aware of your own consciousness in a way that says, that's what mind is. That's what awareness is. And that's what's pointed out in Dzogchen transmission. And it's the transmission of that insight that's going through Dzogchen lineages. And I can't say more than that because now I've given you the broad picture, but as somebody not internal to the system, I can't tell you what it's actually like. And if I were internal to it, I wouldn't be allowed to tell you.
Well, they usually will shift over to Zoom right now, but
Okay.
so many more questions. I'd love to do it just a quick lightning round with you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
All right. So yeah, prepare yourself. Um, so if you could redo your education, what languages would you learn, and in what order?
Classical Chinese and Sanskrit.
No Tibetan, no Pali.
Oh, I'd learned Tibetan as well, but Tibetan's easy once you've got Sanskrit. I would really like to be able to read Sanskrit literature in Sanskrit and not in Tibetan translation. And I would love access to the Chinese tradition and Chinese poetry through classical Chinese. Our mutual friend Red Pine or Bill Porter is somebody who I envy deeply because of his mastery of classical Chinese.
I would love for you to learn Pali, Jay. What would be your one suggestion of a single book as an introduction to Indo-Tibetan Buddhism? What would you suggest?
Probably John Power's Introduction to Tibetan Buddhism.
Okay.
The other one might be Paul Williams' Mahayana Buddhism, the Doctrinal Foundations.
Okay. And would there be, you also teach Western philosophy. That was your initial field of study. What Western philosopher would you recommend to a Buddhist?
David Hume.
David Hume? Okay.
Yep, absolutely.
So this is related to a thought experiment that you give in your book, Losing Ourselves. But other than the Buddha, what other Buddhists would you most love to have the mind of, even if just temporarily?
Nagarjuna.
Nagarjuna. Okay.
Or Chandrakirti.
Okay. I can give you two. So this is also related to that same question, but what realm of being would you be most curious to have the body of temporarily?
Probably a dog.
A dog. Okay.
Yeah.
Devas? What about heavenly beings or?
No.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Have you ever considered ordination as a Buddhist monk?
Not seriously. I'm married. I'm a lay person. I've sometimes thought, gee, that would have been a really good path to have taken, but it's not one that's open to me.
Okay. And what about next life?
Quite possibly, but who knows what next life will be, and who knows whether there will be one.
All right. Well, I still have a lot more questions, but we can leave people thirsting after more. But Jay, thank you so much. I'm going to put the link to the Zoom in the chat.
Okay. So that means I should open the chat, which is over here.
Well, you've also got you've got it in that email. But I'll close down here and just thank you so much, Jay.
I don't see the chat, but I'll get the email and I'll be with you in a moment.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much.
Shortly.
All right. See you.
Bye.